Well, across the Atlantic in Europe, things look even worse. The G20 meeting has begun with Greece looking at a referendum in 5 weeks' time that could see it leave the euro. In the meantime, its Eurozone partners, or should I say partners for now, are holding out on billions of euros in bailout funds already overdue. The Greek finance minister has come out against the referendum, highlighting how close the government in Athens is to collapse. European markets are on the slide this morning. French bank shares are on the rack, and Italy's borrowing costs are creeping higher. And I'm joined now from London by George Magnus, Senior Economic Advisor at UBS Investment Bank. George, welcome to the programme.
Thank you.
Well, I see Chancellor Merkel has said the psychological situation has changed due to Greece's referendum, but we cannot put at stake the great work of unification of the euro. What can save Europe now?
Gosh, if that was a question that was easy to answer, I would. I mean, even before the announcement, which came out of the blue from the Greek Prime Minister, that there would be a referendum, of course, people were generally trying to digest the consequences of the decisions reached about a week ago or so about how they were going to try to get over the last crisis. And already, I think there was a sort of sufficient element of doubt that actually they'd really grasped the nettle in terms of what needed to be done. So what needs to be done to save the euro? I mean, to begin with, they need to put cash on the table. You can't solve a debt crisis without new money because the problem is there just isn't enough money out there between what borrowers need and what lenders want to provide.
But for Nicolas Sarkozy, you say it's come out of the blue. It's a case of sacre bleu, I think. You know, he's now saying he's not going to put up any money into those bailout funds before the referendum.
Right, and so the politicians seem to be absolutely dead set against this and seem to believe that they can persuade the Chinese to put money into a fund that they themselves won't contribute to, which I think is quite delusional, really. But, you know, of course, the Europeans do have a solution. It's called the European Central Bank, which, by virtue of its ability to print money, can actually, at least for the time being, make sure that the financial markets at least kind of calm down a little bit.
Going back to France, because there's a lot of focus, of course, on Germany, but if there is a Greek default, just how serious could it be for the French banks? I see the reports today of a 72% fall in third quarter profits for BNP because of a write-down on Greek sovereign debt and losses from selling European government bonds. Could this indeed be, in a way, a Creditanstalt moment, you know, a beginning of the Great Depression if one of those banks falls over?
Yes, I mean, I think that's what we should be and what European leaders should be basically worried about at the moment is the fact that you could get this kind of chain reaction. So if, for example, Greece were to, or the Greek citizens were to vote to leave the Eurozone, I mean, it still sounds a little bit far-fetched, to be honest, but let's say they did, then, of course, a disorderly default in Greece would basically bring down, obviously, the balance sheets of French banks, which would in turn trigger chain reactions into Italy and maybe even involve, you know, German banks and banks in the UK, you know, that have really seem to be a little bit on the periphery. So, you know, the idea is, I think everybody's understood in the leadership of Europe that you can't have a Greek default without making sure that the banks are backstopped in some shape or form to stop the contagion. Unfortunately, I don't think they've done that yet.
Another potential pot of money, of course, is the IMF, which has so far decided is threatening now not to support Greece. There is talk at G20, certainly from our own Prime Minister, that G20 members should be putting more money into the IMF. Do you think that is a sensible thing to do? And indeed, is G20 too big to make these sort of decisions now?
I actually think it probably is. I mean, I think these are decisions best taken, to be honest, I mean, best discussed amongst the G20, but perhaps best taken by a smaller group of countries. But clearly, you know, the IMF actually only has a loanable fund capacity of about 390 billion US dollars and would badly need to increase that capacity. The trouble is that's, of course, a very political issue itself because the Chinese and the Russians and the Brazilians, for example, have money to put into the fund if they so chose. But of course, that comes at a political price, which the United States and other Western countries aren't always willing to concede. So we'll see what happens. But I imagine the IMF will make at least some sort of gesture of support towards the Eurozone with standby lines of credit and so on.
Let me ask you about these currency wars. This week, Japan intervened $128 billion in 1 week. And the timing, just before the G20, when there's the Japanese finance minister saying it was within the scope of the G20's last statement, which said excess volatility and disorderly movements in exchange rates have adverse implications for economic and financial stability. What sort of signal is this sending?
Well, unfortunately, this is, I say unfortunately, it constitutes a rather unsavory kind of backdrop to discussions about global financial coordination and all that stuff, you know. But the Japanese, of course, aren't alone. I mean, theirs was just the latest in a very high-profile series of currency interventions. The Swiss have been doing it. The Chinese do it all the time to try to, repress the RMB. There have been lots of instances where, countries like Brazil and Turkey and Korea have tried to intervene to suppress their exchange rates. And this is one of the problems which the G20 and the IMF really have to get their heads around, actually, is that it's the very nerdy economic issue of global imbalances and about how you ensure that you have an orderly process for distributing responsibilities between creditor countries like Japan and debtor countries like the United States to basically reform and restructure their economies. But unfortunately, if you don't make any progress in terms of that kind of coordination, what you end up with is stress and tension in the foreign exchange markets, which gives rise to this kind of what you call currency war kind of actions. Yeah.
George, finally, we've got all this volatility happening on a much bigger scale. Do you think this is enough now to rethink the whole idea of the amount of debt that we've got sitting around the world, perhaps even rethink the sort of capitalism that has been built in the world?
Yes, I do. I mean, to be honest with you, I'm just sitting in a studio here, which is just yards away from where the sort of protesters are camped out in front of St. Paul's Cathedral. And this is quite a docile kind of protest. But the whole idea about rights and obligations of citizens versus the state is something which is being challenged by the consequences of the financial and the economic crisis. This isn't going to go away in a hurry. So the idea that, we're going to have to put our thinking caps on and actually figure out how to reform the way capitalism works. I know it sounds a bit kind of ethereal and kind of center page of the newspaper rather than front page, but, I do think that this is kind of where this is all leading, because obviously the status quo in terms of what the crisis has bequeathed us in terms of debt burdens and economic restructuring is just too much for the existing system to take on. So we do have a lot of thinking about how we're going to tackle this.
Indeed we do. George Magnus, thank you very much for joining us there.
Thank you.